I'm calling in from the land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa nations, and that tract of land is currently known as the Chicago area. And I'm wearing glasses and have light skin and long brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue checkered shirt. And I just want to acknowledge that you are welcome here in the fullness of your humanity. And as one way of signaling to one another that we truly are welcome here exactly as we are, irrespective of our identity, age, ability, sexual orientation, gender expression. I want to invite you to place your pronouns alongside your name, if you feel moved to do so. And just in terms of kind of grounding where we are in terms of our arc of practice, both by way of review and also by way of welcoming those who are just arriving today and helping them to find a way in and a mooring. We are now in the Jewish calendar moving toward the 3 weeks, beginning on the 17th of Tammuz, a period of intense mourning for our people that intensifies during the 9 days, beginning on the new moon of Av, and then leading up to Tisha B'Av, the day when we commemorate the destruction of both of our temples and a series of other calamities in Jewish history, including the expulsion from Spain and many others. And Rabbi Ellen Liu, of blessed memory, really invites us to lean into Tisha B'Av as the beginning of our high holiday prep, not the 1st of Elul, but really the 9th of Av, suggesting that the destruction of the temple and all of the violence and oppression and cruelty and brutality that was inflicted upon our people is really an invitation to recognize the inherent groundlessness of everything that is. And certainly, you know, some of us may have had that kind of an awareness during 9/11, for example, you know, when this towering symbol of American industry and might crumbled. I happened to be living in New York at that time. It's kind of hard to not, you know, kind of feel that sense that really there's tremendous groundlessness that characterizes our experience of living. And there are heightened moments when we really can feel that and sense it and become aware of it. But most of the time, we're kind of asleep to it. So Rabbi Liu says that Tisha B'Av is really an opportunity to begin waking up, right? If the shofar during the month of Elul is a wake-up call, we might say that Tisha B'Av is kind of the wake-up call that prepares us for the wake-up call of the shofar. And he also invites us to really explore what happens when we let go of the walls of our solid identity, right? That we tend to hold up as who we are, and instead turn toward that which remains when all of the false identities and masks and personas that we adopt are cleared away. And through that work, he invites us really to cultivate an inner refuge that can never crumble, that isn't subject to the ravages of time, and that is beginningless and endless, which is to say our own divine nature. We do that through the practice of self-inquiry, which is the core grounding practice of this series that we've been exploring through a variety of different entry points and facets. Practice of self-inquiry really asks one question and one question only, and invites us to really examine and observe and pay attention to what's happening inside as a way to answer this question. It's not an analytical question that we're trying to think about and kind of using the left brain arrive at an answer, but more of a question that invites us into the truth of our own experience moment by moment, with clarity, with honesty, and with curiosity. And the question is, who am I? Or who am I really? And as Lou reminds us, the way to discover the answer to the question is really to pay attention to turn toward what's left when all of the walls of our constructed identities come down. So we're going to continue the work that we've done, and today hopefully chart a course forward as well, and talk a little bit about where we go from here, because it's possible that yesterday, today, maybe in previous days, you've caught a little glimpse of your true nature. Kind of like walking about in the night, and it's hard to kind of see the way, but then suddenly there's a flash of lightning and you catch a little glimpse, right? But a glimpse in and of itself doesn't necessarily transform our way of being in the world. So we're going to talk a little bit about where we go from here, but actually first we're going to jump into practice today. And just as by way of review, on Monday and Tuesday, we really questioned our unconscious belief that we are the finite body and that we are the finite mind. And we did that by recognizing the conditioned and transient nature of all physical sensations and mental phenomena. Right? So yes, we may inhabit the body in some way. We experience ourselves as having a body. And yes, we experience ourselves as having a mind, but those two entities can't be essentially who we are, because they're always changing, they're always moving. Right? And then yesterday we examined the timeless nature of awareness itself, which is what remains, right? If you peel away the garments, as it were, of the body and of the finite mind, what's left is just consciousness or awareness. We examined that awareness itself to discover its timeless nature, and explore this essential part of us that remains even as objects of the world, of body and of mind change, crumble, and dissolve. So today we're going to turn, as I said, to the question of living from that nature, right? Not just catching a glimpse here and there, but how do we actually pattern our lives from an awareness of our true nature, from an experience or a recognition or a grounding in our true nature. But first, we're going to dive into meditation, and then we'll come out of meditation and do a little bit of text study and exploration to kind of ground what's next. So I want to invite you to settle into a posture that feels relaxed, rooted, and simultaneously dignified and upright. There's no right or wrong here, only what feels supportive for your body. And the eyes can be open and slightly downcast with a soft gaze, or they can be closed, whichever feels safer and more supportive, more regulating for you, and whichever supports a kind of wakefulness. And I want to invite us to take a couple of deep breaths, really allowing the breath to fill the entire belly and rib cage, all the way up to the collarbones. Nice and slow, and then a deep out breath. Let's just land here in the body, the retaining wall of our mishkan, of our sanctuary, of our inner spiritual home. And then when you're ready, choose an anchor to pay attention to. That could be the rising and falling of your breath in its natural cadence. It could be the sensation of contact between your bottom and whatever support you may be sitting upon, or your feet and the earth. It could be the sensations of sound as they arise, move through consciousness, and pass away. There's no right or wrong anchor here. Any of these anchors will bring you into the present moment. Any of these anchors will facilitate a kind of coupling between body and mind. Choose one and stick with it. And set an intention to remain attentive moment by moment, and to return if and when the mind wanders and you find yourself lost in thought, daydreaming, remembering, planning, projecting, fantasizing. And as you observe in this way with kind curiosity, just notice sensations in the body arise, they move, they dissolve. The body is not a stable, fixed entity. It's more like a fluid energy field. So you're not swept in the current. You're just sitting on the side here, watching the current go by, observing, noticing, allowing. And you might just add the inquiry, is there anything in the body that's stable and solid that I can call a self, that I can call I or me? Is it truer to your experience to say, I am the body, or the body, the process of the body, the energy of the body is moving through me? When you're ready, repeat this process with the objects moving through the mind, thoughts, images, perceptions, volitions, intentions. Observe the mind as if from a watchtower. Watch the movement of the mind. Without being swept into the current. If you do get swept into the current, there's no problem. As soon as you recognize that that's the case, simply relax back into this witnessing stance. And here too, as you observe thoughts and images and other mental phenomena arising, moving through the mind, passing away, giving rise to new movements in the mind, just inquire. Is there anything in the mind that I can call me or myself or I? What's more accurate and true to your experience? The statement, I am this thinking, imagining, conceiving mind, or this process of the mind is moving through me. But isn't who I truly am. Is it not true that even as sensations in the body were transpiring, as objects of the mind were moving and changing and dissolving, that knowing was also happening? So I invite you now to turn your attention down into the knowing itself, the awareness itself, letting go of objects of body and mind. Letting go doesn't mean that they can't be there or arise. It just means that we shift the focus of our attention deeper into our own being and make an effort to hold our attention there in the awareness itself, which is to say, become aware that you are aware. Conscious. Is this consciousness separate from your very beingness? Or is it beingness itself? Don't think about this question, just observe. Pay attention. Inquire. Does this consciousness need to become present? Or is it presence itself? Is this consciousness an object bound by space and time with discrete edges and boundaries, a beginning, a middle, and an end? Or is it pure subjectivity without any of the limits of personhood, space, or time? Does it even have a center? And finally, does it need to acquire peace, contentment, and well-being? Or is it itself inherently and innately peaceful, content, and whole? I want to invite you now to turn your attention back into the body. Into the mind, the finite body and mind, while simultaneously remaining aware that this consciousness is here in the backdrop. Just notice as you attend to the mind, as you attend to the body, does awareness disappear? Or instead, Does it both infuse body and mind? And simultaneously remain untouched by the objects of body and mind moving through it? And in a moment, I'm going to invite you to open your eyes if they've been closed and look at the screen or around the room and notice, is the world ever separate from this awareness? Or is it saturated with and arising within this consciousness? So you can do that as soon as you're ready. Opening the eyes, looking around the screen or around the room. Taking in the colors, shapes, and forms, and inquiring, are they separate from this consciousness? Or are they both saturated with it and arising within it? Thanks for practicing with me, friends. So, of course, your experience is your experience, and you should trust what you have experienced. And simultaneously, I'd like to invite us into an exploration of how we might live from this place, in this inner refuge of pure consciousness, this robe of corporeality, of mentality. So, Kat, if I could ask you to pull up the PDF, that would be super helpful. Thanks, my friend. There are two verses that figure prominently in Hasidic spirituality, and especially around a practice that's called dveikut. Don't worry if you don't know that phrase. It's related to the modern Hebrew word devek, which means glue, right? It means essentially the practice of cleaving to the divine, cleaving to the divine. And actually, that's what we've been cultivating during our time together. We've been developing a practice of dveikut. Our name for God in our tradition is Yod He Vav He. You can see it right here, right in Psalm 16, Yod He Vav He, which is a contraction of the verb haya, was, hoveh, is, and yihiyeh, will be, into a single process. Essentially, it's beingness, because the verb lihiyot also means being. It's beingness that transcends or collapses time. So one way we might think of our name for God is timeless presence, timeless presence. And in my experience, that's exactly what awareness is. Pure consciousness is timeless presence. So the psalmist says, Shiviti Yud He Vav He Lenegdi Tamid Kimi Mini Bal Emot. I place Yud He Vav He, the timeless presence, the presence before me always. With the presence at my right hand, I will not falter. And then Proverbs 3:6, know the presence in all your ways. Bechol derechecha da'ehu. Vehu yeyasher orchotecha. And the presence will level your path. So there's a recognition in our tradition that if we can take refuge in the divine, which is none other than our own consciousness and our own timeless presence, that that practice of really cleaving to that inner dimension of our being can really help us walk the path of life and meet all of its ups and downs, the arising and the passing away, the delight and the grief, the stability and the groundlessness, with from a place of deep equanimity, contentment, and peace. And when Proverbs says that the presence will level your path, it doesn't mean everything's going to be okay. Right? It doesn't mean that you're going to get healed from cancer, or that you won't have to deal with sickness, aging and death. It doesn't mean that the war in Ukraine is going to end. What it does mean is that even in the midst of all of the fluctuations and the difficulty, we can maintain an inner stance of balance, of inherent well-being, of inherent wholeness. So Kat, you can take down the screen share. When I was in the hospital a couple of weeks ago for emergency surgery, because I got this inexplicable infection in my finger, I just I felt so grateful for my practice of dveikut, which is a practice that I try to practice continuously throughout my days, to remain aware of this consciousness in the backdrop. And when you do that day after day, both in formal meditation practice and then, as you're going about all of your activities, as the verse from Proverbs says, right? Wherever you're going, no matter what you're doing, da'ehu, know the one. Eventually, the recognition begins to stabilize. And the locus of your identity begins to shift from the small, finite egoic self, which is bound up with the finite body, mind, and the belief I am the body, I am the mind. It begins to shift into the view and perspective and feeling, because it infuses the body, of true nature. So I was there in the hospital, didn't want to be there, didn't want to have surgery, didn't want to be in pain, not like I was happy about any of it. But inside of me, there was a tremendous quiet contentment, tremendous quiet peacefulness, a tremendous joy. Not in spite of the movement and the difficulty and the change and the shifting sands of my life, but with all of those difficulties. So when it comes to the question of where do we go from here and how do we live from this place, the answer is that we need to stabilize our recognition and develop our capacity to shift from the egoic identity or the personality or our personhood into the perspective of pure awareness. To go back to the metaphor or the parable that I used a couple of days ago, that we need to be able to, or I should say, I found it very helpful in my life, right, to be able to shift from the perspective of the wave to the perspective of the ocean. And once you've had the perspective of the ocean, you can then go back to being a wave, but without being so preoccupied with your own individual selfhood as this, individual particular wave. There's a couple of beautiful readings I just want to share with you before we turn to Mourner's Kaddish. Kat, if you could pull up the screen share, that would be really wonderful as well. And I pray that in today's practice, you had a little bit of a taste of what it's like to be in the world of changing objects of world, body, and mind, and simultaneously to be able to look upon all of those changing phenomena from the perspective of the consciousness itself. And if you could scroll down, Kat, and I'll invite you all to take a look at the text from the Baal Shem Tov at another time. If you could scroll down to the reading from Tara Brach. The Sufi poet Rumi is quoted as saying, "What comes into being gets lost in being and drunkenly forgets its way home." As part of the human journey, we each forget the vastness and depths of our awareness and love and become increasingly identified with the limited body and mind, donning masks to hide the pain of unmet needs and to defend our vulnerability. We further narrow our sense of who we are. We wear the disguise of busy, important person, or angry victim, or deficient person, or obsessed, addicted person. Sometimes it's depressed person or anxious person, superior person, loser. And actually all of these could live within us individually, right? And arise at different times when the circumstances are ripe. Most of us have a whole closet full of assumed personas. They might help us survive some challenging times, but the problem is we become identified with our masks and we end up believing that these false images are who we really are. But that's not the whole story, my friends. Just as it is a natural part of the human journey to put on these masks and get lost behind them, it is also part of our evolutionary unfolding to wake up to the fact that we are caught in a mistaken and confused identity. Sooner or later, slowly or quickly, we come to see that we've been living in a trance, attached to a cluster of familiar masks that keep us believing we are separate and deficient. Courageously attending to the suffering of this trance awakens our longing to reconnect with the basic goodness we have always intuited is here. That suffering and longing are our own awareness, calling us home to our full intelligence, sensitivity, and love. And if we can turn to Alan Liu, and we'll wrap up here and turn to Kaddish. We started with Alan Liu. Let's close with Alan Liu. He says, "So it is in meditation. We inhabit this very place. We enter into intimate relation with it. We inhabit the most basic elements of our present tense reality, our breath, and our body. And we fill these things with consciousness until they glow, until they become vibrant, radiant. Then this vibrancy fills us body and mind, and we walk through the world with it, awakening every moment," I believe is the next word, "from the dimly lit fantasy we have been caught in until now to a luminous, sacred world, a world suffused with the presence of God." Let's turn to Mourner's Kaddish.
Thank you so much, my friend. Friends, those of you who are in mourning or observing yahrzeit, if it's your custom to participate in the Kaddish, are invited to do so. And if you're not reciting Kaddish, we ask that you please stay present for those who are. Create a minyan of comfort and support for them. Thanks to Kat, who's holding our space, for sharing the words of the Kaddish on the screen. If you'd like to put the name or names of those you're honoring today in the chat box, you're welcome to do so now or after we recite Kaddish. And if you are reciting Kaddish, please join me by rising in body or in spirit, and you can unmute at this time. Yikadal, Yikadash, Yalma, Yehesh me Rabba Barach Olam Maya Barach Yishtabach 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 Yishalev Yishtabach La'elam Yikol Bechata B'Shirata B'Chata V'Nechemata Iran Ba'alma V'Yivru Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya L'Chaim Aleinu V'Yal Kol Yisrael Imru,
Yaseh Shalom, Enobiah,
Shalom Imromav, Oseh Shalom Alim Yisrael Kol Yisrael, Yal Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Imru, Amen.
Amen.
And friends, of course, thank you so much for joining us today. If you're leaving us now, we hope you'll join us tomorrow to close out our week of practice led by Rebecca Schisler, who will lead us in sitting into Shabbat together for the weekend. I want to take the moment here just to express our collective hodaya, our gratitude to you, Sam, for this extraordinary 4 days of practice and a beautiful, very much condensed, but just a beautiful journey, and for bringing us into for a secure, smooth landing together. Thank Kat for holding our space as always, and thank each of you for being here. As always, you're welcome to use the next 15 minutes if you'd like to continue to sit, to use this container. If you want to turn the volume off on your device, you're welcome to just stay with us in community and practice if you'd like, or join us for a conversation with Sam about the teaching, or share your reflections on your experience in the chat. Sam, I know, there were there's a whole pile of excellent questions that have accumulated over the last few days. I have a question, but I just want to see if you want to pick up with anything that struck you about any of the questions that came in previously. Otherwise, I have a question for you.
Yeah, I just want to say, because the question of sleep came up yesterday, right? The sleeping state, because it seems like we're not conscious when we sleep, right? Which would seem to suggest that consciousness is itself impermanent. And this is something we can check out, actually, both when we're falling asleep and when we're waking up, and also throughout the night, because first of all, we know that we've fallen asleep, right? And we also know that we've woken up. And if someone were to ask you, how did you sleep? You would be able to answer them. I slept deeply, I slept well, my sleep was interrupted, So the materialist view, which says that awareness is just an epiphenomenon, kind of an accident of our neural firing, right? And that the only thing that's real really is matter. It suggests that when you go to sleep, consciousness is gone, it disappears, because the neural firing and the input from the outside world that's coming in, right, isn't operating, and so consciousness doesn't arise. Okay. But a spiritual orientation that's grounded in the approach that I'm teaching and practicing is that actually sleep itself is an object arising within consciousness. Right? Like all other objects, it's impermanent. It has discrete edges and boundaries. It has a duration, right? A finite duration. And so we can check this out, actually. We can observe as we're falling asleep, as we're waking up in the morning. Was I unconscious? Is that actually true? Or was sleep just another phenomenon, right, arising within consciousness? It has some of the same qualities of, any object of body and mind, which is to say it's finite, it's an object, it's discrete, it has a specific kind of duration, that's finite, and so on and so forth. The only difference is that our sense of being a separate self doesn't exist in sleep. But remember, the consciousness that I'm pointing to here is transpersonal. It's not a consciousness that has an identity as a person. And so there doesn't need to be a sense of self within that consciousness for the consciousness to be there,
Mhm.
right? It can be there without any sense of self whatsoever. So this is something we can check out in our moment-to-moment experience. My experience is such that I've concluded that sleep itself is a finite object arising within consciousness, within impersonal consciousness.
Yeah, I would love to probe that a little bit more. I'm going to build on Susan's question about how do we practice inquiring so that it does not drop us into thinking. And I guess I want to invite you, you were making this distinction between thinking, thought, the intellect, and awareness and consciousness, in which my sense is from the way you're describing it, that kind of thought kind of dissolves in a way, where we move into a deeper mode. So anyway, I just wanted to, this practice of dveikut, of cleaving, of being, sometimes we'll hear it in mindfulness instruction as being flush with our experience, right? So there's no gap that's there. We're in it in a way, right? Not outside it. So how would you speak about that in terms of inquiry?
Yeah.
And whether you differentiate that from thinking, is that just a gateway into consciousness?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things about that. It's a great question. So first of all, I've been stressing again and again that we're just observing our experience, right? Even as we observe our experience, we can have a lens through which we look. So the question, who am I, is like a lens. It helps to focus our attention. But it's not meant to be a question that we think about analytically, because the finite mind can never come to know the infinite impersonal consciousness. That which is finite cannot come to know the infinite. Only the infinite can know itself, right? Or be itself is a more accurate way of talking about it. So you can think about the nature of consciousness from now until the cows come home, but you won't know its nature unless consciousness comes to know its own nature, unless infinite consciousness comes to know its own infinite nature. Are you with me? So me as a person, for the time being, until one becomes fully enlightened, which I am not, right? But me as a person, right? I have to stand back here as a person possessed of what seems like a personal thinking mind, and I have to focus my attention in a certain way through the lens of the inquiry, so that consciousness can actually, so that thought itself can subside back into its source, and consciousness can come to know its own nature. It's never the person or the thinker who knows the nature of consciousness. It's consciousness that comes to know its own nature. The other thing I'll say is that this particular question, who am I, in my experience, has a kind of penetrating power to cut through the delusion that I am the thinking mind, and coaxes the mind, as it were, to rest back into its source in pure consciousness, right? So one way you might do this on the go, because we're talking about dveikut, and how do we do this all the time, right?
Right. How do you do it when you're on the checkout line?
Yeah. So one thing that you do, and you have to develop a little kind of conventional mindfulness here, is that, for example, I'll see a thought arising in my mind. It could be a neutral thought, I've got to get this or that done. It could be a charged thought, like, oh, look at that person, I have all these judgments about them, or I'm attracted to them, or whatever it is, right? But what I do is I ask myself, who's having the thought? And the answer is, I am, obviously, right? And then I ask, who am I? And what generally happens for me when I ask that question is that the thinking mind goes quiet. And it basically subsides back into its source in pure consciousness. That won't work for everyone necessarily.
We're gonna work to we're gonna copyright that little.
Well, it's not mine. That particular technique comes directly from Ramana Maharshi, the 20th century Advaita Vedanta master. We find that question in our own teachings. I mean, look at the Piazetzner Rabbi,
Well, I will say
a couple of days ago, right? Who said, "Aye atabe atzmecha," right? Where is your true essence? That's a form of self-inquiry.
Yeah, but Sam, what I'm thinking of is what Moses says at the bush right there. He says, "Mi anochi," right? Who am I?
Exactly. Who am I?
It's a pretty Jewish question there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before, I want to make sure we get time for this question because we have about 5 minutes. Excuse me. Really good. I think an important question from Pam. I long to reach what you describe and what Rabbi Lou describes, but my experience from the very beginning of today's practice was fear, the ego fearing annihilation. Any suggestions for helping to tend to this fear? Because I think that's really, such a universal experience that, yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to be one with the universe, but then where will I be? I'll be
Yeah.
gone. I will, right? This is the,
Yeah.
right. So maybe
Such
we
a good
better address
question.
that. Yeah.
I just want to say my suspicion is that everyone who engages in self-inquiry will come up against that fear at some point. The ego doesn't want to be questioned or challenged. It feels threatened by this practice. I'll just say, number one, the ego doesn't disappear completely when we do this practice. It's just that our identification with the ego and our localization of our sense of identity within the ego, right, is what becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. So you don't have to worry that you'll suddenly kind of like disappear into la la land and you won't be able to function as a separate self. It's just that you won't be so attached to that sense of being a separate self, right? And as such, you won't experience the tremendous contraction and suffering that comes with self-clinging. So, the actually, contrary to what the ego says, right, you experience much more joy, much more equanimity, much more balance, much more responsiveness, much more spaciousness and freedom in your life. And all the while with the ability to be really engaged in the fullness of life and all of its beauty and blessing and suffering, right? You don't become kind of like just kind of a disembodied consciousness. To the contrary, because you have that kind of stability and you recognize everything that's unfolding as an expression of this pure consciousness, and therefore inherently holy and beautiful, you can engage more deeply with the world. That's my experience at any rate. But the other thing, here's something that happened to me, is that my ego says, you're not allowed to be this happy. And so it concocts all kinds of stratagems to try and make me stop the inquiry, right? Like, oh, this practice isn't working, it's stupid. I should just go back to observing my breath. Or, let me give it up altogether and do some other form of practice. Maybe I should do yoga, whatever it is. Your mind will come up with a million different strategies, and we need to be very careful and subtle, right? And not identifying with and believing those stories that the mind puts up, because it's just the mind's way of saying, right, this is freaking me out a little bit. I don't want to let go. I don't want to let go. There's a reason we have egos. And the ego doesn't want to give up the ghost so readily. So that's my experience, and it's all fine and it's all natural, but don't give up the inquiry is what I would say, right? Keep going, because what's in store for you on the other end, if you can stabilize your recognition and really come into a deep faith that this is your true nature, and then live from that place and be cognizant of it whenever you remember to shift your attention back into it. You're just gonna, if your experience is anything like mine, you'll just have so much more joy and happiness and balance and stability and love and compassion that will just naturally flow from your true nature.
All right. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for the gift of these 4 wonderful sessions and beautiful series and teaching from the heart, and your vulnerability, your honesty, and really sharing, from the depth of your own practice, which is such a gift always. So thanks to you, thanks to Kat for holding our space. Thanks to each of you for being here. I will say that this, I think, in my memory, is the first time that we actually had more people attending the last session in a series than at the beginning. So that's a great testament to the power of the teaching, Sam, and to each of you for your dedication to the practice, for showing up each day. So thanks for being here. And we hope you'll join us tomorrow to sit into Shabbat with Rebecca Schisler. And many blessings to you all. Be well.
All the very best. Many blessings.